At some point in history, someone held each of these stones in their hand. They looked at it carefully, they made a decision, and then they let it go. Not because they were careless, not because they didn't know what gemstones were, but because at the time, there was no reason to keep it. It didn't sparkle. It didn't fit any known category. It didn't behave the way valuable stones were expected to behave. So it was left behind. This video is not about gemstones that were stolen, lost, or hidden away. It is about stones that were actively dismissed, set aside, ignored, or thrown away, because every available piece of knowledge said they didn't matter. In some cases, experts misclassified them. In others, science hadn't caught up yet, and sometimes the stones simply looked too ordinary to deserve a second glance. Years later, those same stones would be studied, documented, and protected, not because they changed, but because understanding did. Today, we're counting down 10 gemstones that people didn't lose by accident. They lost them by judgment. And as this list unfolds, one question becomes unavoidable. If value can remain invisible for so long, what else might still be misunderstood today? Let's begin at number 10, ranked 10th. Smoky quartz, the stone people dismissed because it looked like nothing at all. Smoky quartz rarely looks like something worth saving. In its rough form, it appears dark, cloudy, and uneven, often brown or gray, sometimes almost black. To the untrained eye, it blends perfectly with ordinary landscape rock. For decades, this was exactly the problem. When people encountered smoky quartz in the field, the decision was usually quick. It wasn't clear. It didn't sparkle. It didn't resemble the gemstones displayed behind glass cases. Compared to bright amethyst or colorless crystal quartz, smoky quartz felt like a failed version of something better. So it was set aside, left behind, or quietly discarded. At the time, that decision made sense. For much of the 20th century, gemstone value was closely tied to visual purity. Transparency, brilliance, and color saturation were treated as indicators of worth. Smoky quartz offered none of those traits. Its color looked like contamination. Its darkness suggested damage. Many assumed it was quartz that had been altered, degraded, or exposed to something undesirable underground. What was not understood yet was why smoky quartz looked the way it did. Later research revealed that smoky quartz owes its color not to impurities, but to natural radiation interacting with aluminum within the crystal lattice. This process occurs deep underground over immense spans of time. The color was not a flaw. It was evidence of geological stability, pressure, and age. But by the time this understanding became widespread, countless rough specimens had already been ignored. In mining operations, smoky quartz was often treated as waste material. It was too common to store, too dull to sell, and too heavy to justify transporting. Collectors walked past it. Prospectors focused on brighter finds. Entire deposits were crushed or discarded without a second thought. Ironically, it was this very abundance and indifference that preserved smoky quartz in a quiet secondary role for decades. As gemological science advanced, perceptions began to shift. Researchers recognized smoky quartz as one of the most stable quartz varieties, capable of retaining its color without enhancement. Unlike many treated stones, its appearance was entirely natural. Museums began documenting regional varieties. Collectors started paying attention to depth of tone, clarity within darkness, and crystal formation. What once looked like nothing became something specific. In hindsight, smoky quartz represents a recurring pattern in gemstone history. Value delayed not by rarity, but by misunderstanding. It was never rare in the ground. It was rare in appreciation. Today, high-quality smoky quartz, especially well-formed natural crystals, holds a respected place among collectors. Not because it competes with diamonds or sapphires, but because it tells a quieter story. That appearance alone is an unreliable measure of worth. Smoky quartz was not thrown away because people were careless. It was thrown away because, at the time, no one had a reason to look closer. And most importantly, that's why it deserves to be on this list. Ranked 9th. Hematite. The stone people rejected because it felt wrong to hold. Weathered hematite is often discarded before it is even examined, not because of how it looks, but because of how it feels. The moment it is picked up, its weight surprises people. For a stone of its size, it feels unusually heavy, dense, almost uncomfortable in the hand. That single sensation has shaped its fate more than any visual trait. When encountered in the field, weathered hematite rarely invites curiosity. Its surface is dark, matte, sometimes dusty. There is no sparkle, no transparency, no immediate sign of refinement. To many, it resembles industrial waste or rusted metal rather than a natural stone with significance. Combined with its weight, it creates an instinctive reaction. This is not something to keep. That reaction is not careless. It is deeply human. For decades, gemstone value was associated with lightness, clarity, and visual appeal. Stones that felt heavy were subconsciously linked to labor, industry, or raw material, not to objects of curiosity or preservation. Hematite triggered that bias instantly. It felt like work, not wonder. And so it was set aside. In mining regions, this bias had real consequences. Weathered hematite fragments were often swept away during sorting, especially if they lacked obvious crystal faces. If the material did not meet industrial-grade specifications, it was ignored entirely. Collectors walked past it, assuming anything so dense and dark must be common, replaceable, and uninteresting. What was not widely understood was that hematite's weight is precisely what makes it significant. As mineralogical research advanced, hematite emerged as one of the most important iron oxides in Earth's geological history. Its density reflects tightly packed atomic structures formed under specific conditions of pressure and oxidation. Weathered surfaces, once interpreted as damage, were revealed to be records of long-term environmental exposure, evidence of chemical stability across immense spans of time. In other words, hematite was not heavy because it was crude. It was heavy because it was complete. Scientific study also revealed that not all hematite is the same. Crystal habits, surface textures, and formation environments vary widely. Some specimens formed in ancient seabeds. Others developed through volcanic or hydrothermal processes no longer active. Each weathered piece carried information that polished stones often erased. By the time this understanding reached beyond academic circles, many specimens were already gone. Museums and serious collectors eventually reframed hematite's value. Polished examples revealed a metallic luster unlike any transparent gemstone. Natural crystals displayed sharp geometry and reflective planes. Even weathered fragments gained importance, not for display, but for documentation. They became reference points for understanding Earth's past, not accessories for adornment. The irony is clear. Hematite was thrown away not because it lacked value, but because it violated expectations. It felt too heavy to be special, too dense to be delicate, too serious to be admired. Yet that same weight is what allowed it to endure unchanged while softer materials eroded away. Weathered hematite stands as a reminder that some stones are dismissed not for what they are, but for how they feel at first contact. And in the long history of gemstones, that instinctive rejection has proven to be one of the most costly mistakes of all. Ranked 8th. Obsidian. The stone people discarded because it was placed in the wrong category. Unpolished obsidian was rarely rejected for being unattractive. It was rejected for being misclassified. To most people encountering it in the field, obsidian fragments look like broken glass, sharp, black, irregular, and hazardous. They were treated as debris rather than material. Once labeled that way, they were no longer examined. They were removed, swept aside, or intentionally thrown away. That classification felt sensible. In modern environments, glass is associated with danger, waste, and accidents. Anything resembling shattered glass is cleared for safety, not collected for curiosity. Obsidian suffered from that association. Its glossy surfaces and razor-like edges triggered caution rather than interest. It did not resemble a gemstone. It did not resemble an ore. It did not resemble anything people had been taught to preserve. So it was categorized as a problem. What that category obscured was obsidian's true nature. Obsidian is not glass produced by humans. It is volcanic glass, formed when molten lava cools so rapidly that crystals never have time to develop. This absence of crystalline structure is not a flaw. It is a geological signature of speed, temperature, and violent transformation. For most of human history, obsidian was not discarded at all. It was sought after. Before metals became widespread, obsidian was among the sharpest materials available to early civilizations. Its natural fracture patterns produced edges finer than many modern surgical blades. Entire tool industries depended on it. Trade networks formed around specific volcanic sources, and fragments traveled across continents long before written records existed. That history, however, was invisible to modern eyes. As industrial materials replaced stone tools, obsidian lost its practical context. Without polish or shaping, raw fragments no longer signaled usefulness or beauty. They became indistinguishable from industrial waste in the minds of those who encountered them. Construction sites removed them, rock collectors ignored them. Even in volcanic regions, obsidian fragments were treated as clutter rather than specimens. Scientific study later revealed how costly that misclassification had been. Geochemical analysis showed that obsidian sources are extraordinarily specific. Each volcanic event produces glass with a unique chemical fingerprint. By studying unpolished fragments, researchers can trace ancient trade routes with remarkable accuracy. A small shard can identify where it formed, when it erupted, and how far it traveled in human hands. In this way, unpolished obsidian became one of the most precise tools for understanding early human movement and exchange. Museums began preserving fragments that would once have been swept away. Collectors learned to recognize flow banding, hydration layers, and fracture patterns, features that only exist in raw material. What had been labeled dangerous debris was reclassified as historical evidence. The irony is difficult to overlook. Obsidian was thrown away not because it lacked value, but because it was placed in the wrong mental box. It was treated as broken glass rather than frozen lava, as hazard rather than record, as waste rather than witness. Unpolished obsidian reminds us that when something is categorized incorrectly, it does not matter how important it truly is. Once the label is wrong, the decision follows automatically. And in this case, that decision sent countless fragments of human history into the discard pile, sharp, silent, and misunderstood. Ranked 7th, turquoise. The stone people abandoned because it looked too fragile to last. Chalky, untreated turquoise has long been misunderstood, not for lacking beauty, but for appearing too delicate to survive. In its natural state, it can look pale, powdery, even brittle. Veins run through it, surfaces flake, colors fade unevenly. To many observers, these traits signal weakness rather than worth. When encountered outside of finished jewelry, untreated turquoise often inspired doubt. It didn't feel durable. It didn't feel permanent. Compared to harder gemstones, it seemed unstable, something that would crack, crumble, or deteriorate with time. In an era increasingly focused on polish and durability, that perception was enough to seal its fate. Discarding it felt logical. For much of the modern gemstone trade, value became synonymous with resilience. Stones were expected to withstand cutting, setting, and daily wear without changing. Chalky turquoise failed that test. It absorbed oils. It reacted to moisture. It showed wear quickly. Dealers rejected it in favor of stabilized or treated material that could survive commercial handling. Collectors followed suit. Unstabilized turquoise was labeled low-grade, unfinished, or simply not worth the trouble. Mining operations often set aside pale, crumbly pieces as waste. Some deposits were abandoned entirely because the material did not meet market expectations for hardness or uniform color. Entire generations learned to associate quality with treatment and fragility with failure. What was overlooked was that chalkiness was not a defect. It was authenticity. Untreated turquoise reflects its formation environment with unusual honesty. Its porosity records the conditions under which it developed: water chemistry, mineral saturation, and geological pressure over time. The very traits that made it difficult to commercialize were the traits that confirmed it was natural and unaltered. As sources of high-quality turquoise dwindled, perspectives began to change. Researchers and historians recognize that many of the most culturally significant turquoise artifacts, from ancient American Southwest adornments to early ceremonial objects, were made from material that would be rejected by modern standards. These stones were never meant to be permanent in the commercial sense. They were meant to be worn, handled, and passed through generations, even as they slowly changed. Collectors eventually noticed a pattern. The most respected historic pieces were not made from hardened, stabilized turquoise. They were made from softer, untreated material that carried age visibly. Color variation became a marker of provenance. Surface wear became evidence of history. Chalkiness, once a reason to discard a stone, became proof that it had not been altered to meet market demands. By the time the shift occurred, much had already been lost. Untreated turquoise had been thrown away, not because it lacked beauty, but because it failed a durability test it was never meant to pass. It was judged by modern expectations rather than by historical context. Fragility was mistaken for inferiority. Today, chalky turquoise occupies a very different position. It is valued not for its toughness, but for its honesty. It shows exactly what time does to stone, and what stone does in response. No coatings, no reinforcement, no illusion of permanence. Turquoise teaches a quiet lesson. Some stones are not meant to resist change. They are meant to record it. And for a long time, that vulnerability was treated as a reason to let them go, when it should have been the very reason to keep them. Ranked 6th, Moonstone. The stone people dismissed for lacking clarity because purity became an obsession. Cloudy moonstone has often been rejected before its nature was understood. In rough or lightly worked form, it appears milky, uneven, and opaque. Light does not pass cleanly through it. Instead, it diffuses, scatters, and softens. To eyes trained by modern gemstone standards, this lack of transparency has long been interpreted as a flaw. For much of the 20th century, gemstone value became closely tied to a single idea: purity. Clear stones were considered superior. Inclusions were defects. Cloudiness was failure. Against this framework, moonstone struggled to justify its presence. Compared to transparent sapphires or colorless quartz, cloudy feldspar seemed unfinished, something that never reached its intended state. As a result, many pieces were set aside. In mining and sorting environments, cloudy moonstone was routinely separated from clearer material. Stones that failed to show immediate brilliance were labeled low-grade. Collectors passed over them, assuming the haze indicated weakness or damage within the structure. Without obvious color or sparkle, moonstone appeared unremarkable, especially when viewed under harsh lighting designed to reward clarity above all else. What this approach missed was that moonstone's value was never meant to be found in transparency. Moonstone belongs to the feldspar family, and its defining feature, adolescence, does not exist without internal layering. The soft glow that seems to float beneath the surface is created by light scattering between microscopic lamellae within the stone. Remove the cloudiness, and the effect disappears. The very trait that caused rejection was the trait responsible for moonstone's identity. For decades, this nuance was poorly understood outside specialist circles. As gemological research advanced, perceptions slowly changed. Scientists demonstrated that the most desirable moonstones were not the clearest, but those with balanced internal structures capable of producing a floating, shifting sheen. Uniform transparency, once prized, became less important than internal composition. Cloudiness was no longer a defect, it was a prerequisite. By then, many stones were already gone. Cloudy moonstones had been discarded not because they lacked value, but because they did not conform to a narrow definition of purity. They were judged by rules borrowed from other gemstones, rules that did not apply. In the pursuit of clarity, their unique optical behavior was overlooked entirely. Collectors eventually relearned what earlier cultures had understood intuitively. Moonstone was never meant to shine sharply. It was meant to glow softly. Its appeal lies in movement rather than brilliance, in atmosphere rather than precision. Ancient traditions valued moonstone for its shifting light, not for its transparency. Long before modern grading standards existed. Today, high-quality moonstone is recognized by qualities that would once have caused it to be rejected. Even coloration, depth of glow, and internal texture are carefully evaluated. Stones that appear too clear are often considered less interesting than those with a visible internal landscape. The irony is unmistakable. Moonstone was thrown away because it failed a test designed for other gems. It was dismissed for being cloudy in a world that equated clarity with worth. Yet without that cloudiness, Moonstone would be nothing more than ordinary feldspar. Its story serves as a reminder that purity, when misunderstood, can become a blindfold. Some stones do not reveal their value by becoming clearer. They reveal it by refusing to be clear at all. Ranked fifth, Garnet. The stone people overlooked because familiarity turned into fatigue. Dark red garnet in its rough form rarely invites excitement. It appears dense, opaque, and unremarkable. Often a deep wine or brownish red that blends easily with surrounding rock. There is no immediate brilliance, no sharp contrast, and no visual cue that demands attention. For many, it looks like something already known, already seen, already understood. That sense of familiarity has been garnet's greatest disadvantage. For centuries, garnet has been one of the most widespread gemstones encountered by humans. Its presence across multiple continents in geological environments created a lasting impression. Garnet is common, and once a stone is labeled common, curiosity tends to disappear. When miners and collectors encountered dark red rough garnet, the decision was often effortless. There was no urgency to keep it, no fear of missing something rare. It could always be found again. Or so it seemed. Discarding it felt reasonable. In sorting environments, darker garnet rough was frequently set aside in favor of brighter materials. Without cutting, its color looked muddy. Without light passing through, its depth went unnoticed. Collectors focused on stones that promised immediate visual reward. Garnet, especially in darker tones, offered none. It was quietly categorized as filler rather than focus. What this reaction overlooked was that garnet is not a single stone, it is a family. As mineralogical classification became more refined, scientists identified multiple garnet species with vastly different compositions and formation histories. Some formed under extreme pressures deep within the Earth's mantle. Others crystallized in environments no longer accessible. Certain varieties, once grouped together by color alone, were revealed to be rare expressions within an otherwise familiar name. Dark red rough pieces in particular often concealed this complexity. To the untrained eye, one garnet looked much like another. But chemical analysis later showed that some of these overlooked stones belonged to highly specific types, with limited geographic distribution and unique physical properties. Their value was never obvious on the surface. It required context, not contrast. By the time this understanding reached beyond academic circles, much had already been lost. Collectors eventually recognized that garnet's ubiquity had created a dangerous assumption. Familiarity had replaced evaluation. Stones were judged by reputation rather than by individual character. Darker pieces, lacking dramatic color shifts or transparency, were ignored despite carrying information and potential that lighter stones could not. The shift in perception was gradual but decisive. Today, garnet is appreciated not for novelty, but for diversity. Subtle differences in color, density, and structure are examined carefully. Dark red garnets are no longer dismissed as uninteresting by default. Instead, they are studied for what they represent: geological consistency under conditions that destroy less stable minerals. The irony is clear. Garnet was thrown away not because it lacked value, but because it felt too familiar to question. When something appears everywhere, it stops being examined. And when examination stops, significance is easily missed. Dark red garnet stands as a reminder that rarity does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind a name everyone thinks they already understand. Ranked fourth, Spinel. The stone people discarded because a trusted label told them it didn't matter. Rough Spinel has one of the most revealing histories in gemology, not because it was rare or fragile, but because it was judged through the wrong lens. In its natural state, Spinel often resembles gemstones that were already well known. Red Spinel looked like ruby that failed to qualify. Blue Spinel resembled sapphire that seemed slightly off. Once that comparison was made, the conclusion followed quickly. If it wasn't ruby or sapphire, it wasn't worth keeping. For much of modern gem history, authority played a decisive role in determining value. Stones were not always examined on their own terms. They were measured against established categories: When rough spinel failed to meet the expected standards of corundum, whether in hardness, optical response, or color tone, it was dismissed as inferior material rather than questioned as something different. That decision was rarely emotional, it was procedural. In mining operations and sorting rooms, rough spinel that could not be confidently sold as ruby or sapphire was set aside. There was no incentive to investigate further. Storage space was limited. Time was valuable. Stones that did not fit known classifications were treated as mistakes, not mysteries. Once labeled, they were removed from consideration entirely. What no one paused to consider was whether the comparison itself was flawed. Spinel is not a lesser version of another gemstone. It is a distinct mineral species with its own crystal structure and chemical composition. Its colors form naturally without the internal stresses or treatments common in other stones. In many cases, Spinel crystals grow under narrower geological conditions than the gemstones they were mistaken for. But without advanced testing, these differences remain invisible. As a result, Spinel disappeared quietly. Historical records later revealed how deep this misidentification ran. Some of the most celebrated rubies in royal collections were eventually identified as Spinel. These stones had always been admired, but misunderstood. Outside elite settings, however, rough Spinel received no such reconsideration. Without polish or prestige, it remained a rejected comparison. The correction came late. As gemological science progressed, improved analytical tools made it possible to distinguish Spinel accurately. What had once been rejected as substandard ruby was recognized as a gemstone with exceptional stability, clarity, and color integrity. Researchers began reevaluating old collections. Dealers adjusted classifications. But the majority of rough material had already been discarded decades earlier. The loss was not accidental, it was systematic. Spinel was thrown away because someone in authority said it wasn't what people were looking for. That judgment went unchallenged, repeated across generations, and reinforced by habit. Once a stone is defined by what it is not, its true identity rarely survives long enough to be discovered. Today, Spinel is respected as an independent gemstone, valued for the very qualities that once caused it to be dismissed. Its history now serves as a warning. When classification replaces curiosity, understanding is the first thing to be lost. Spinel's story is not about rarity overlooked. It is about identity denied, and the quiet cost of trusting the wrong label for too long. Ranked third, Benitoite. The stone people let go because no one knew it was singular. Before it had a name, Benitoite had no place to belong. Small, pale blue crystals appeared alongside more familiar minerals and were dismissed almost immediately. They were too modest in size to impress, too subtle in color to demand attention, and too unfamiliar to classify. Without recognition, they were treated as geological curiosities at best, and mistakes at worst. When encountered in the field, benitoid rarely triggered excitement. Its crystals were often mistaken for low-grade sapphire or written off as insignificant quartz variants. Without dramatic brilliance or size, there was little incentive to preserve them. Prospectors focused on materials they understood. Collectors followed established categories. Anything that did not fit was quietly set aside. That decision made sense at the time. Gemstone value depends heavily on context. A stone without a known identity has no market, no reference point, and no reason to be kept. Early benitoid existed outside all three. It appeared before the science required to explain it was widely available. Without a framework to measure its importance, its presence was easy to ignore. What no one realized was that benitoid was not merely uncommon, it was unique. Its formation conditions were extraordinarily specific, requiring a precise combination of elements and geological circumstances that occurred in only one known location. Unlike stones found across multiple regions, benitoite's source was singular. Once disturbed, it could not be replicated elsewhere. But this exclusivity was invisible in the early stages, hidden behind a calm, unremarkable appearance. Recognition came slowly and unevenly. When benitoite was eventually identified as a distinct mineral species, the implications were immediate. Many early specimens had already been discarded, crushed, or lost. The remaining material revealed a gemstone of extreme rarity, one that could never be replaced once removed from its source. What had once been overlooked as trivial was suddenly understood as irreplaceable. By then, the opportunity had passed. Benitoite had been thrown away not because it lacked beauty or stability, but because it arrived ahead of its explanation. It existed before anyone knew how to name it, categorize it, or protect it. Without recognition, even rarity has no defense. Today, benitoid is regarded as one of the rarest gemstones ever documented. Its value is inseparable from its scarcity and singular origin. But its story remains a quiet lesson in timing. Discovery alone is not enough. Without understanding, even the rarest stone can disappear unnoticed. Benitoite reminds us that some losses occur not through carelessness, but through absence of knowledge. When a stone appears before the language exists to describe it, the result's often the same. It is left behind. Ranked second, Alexandrite. The stone people dismissed because it refused to reveal itself on demand. In daylight, rough Alexandrite rarely looks impressive. Its surface appears muted, often greenish, gray, or brown, with little brilliance and no obvious character. To anyone encountering it under ordinary conditions, it resembles an unremarkable piece of chrysoberyl. There is no flash, no intensity, and no visual reason to hesitate before setting it aside. That first impression has shaped its history. When Alexandrite was encountered in rough form, the decision was usually made quickly and confidently. It lacked color appeal. It lacked transparency. Most importantly, it lacked any visible trait that suggested rarity. Under daylight, it behaved like an ordinary stone, and stones that look ordinary are rarely kept. Discarding it felt justified. Gemstone evaluation has long depended on what can be seen immediately. Stones are judged under consistent lighting, compared side by side, and sorted according to appearance. Alexandrite performs poorly in that system. Its defining property, dramatic color change, does not appear under standard conditions. Without exposure to different light sources, its identity remains completely hidden. What made Alexandrite extraordinary was also what caused it to be overlooked. The color change effect that later defined Alexandrite requires specific lighting environments. In daylight, the stone suppresses its potential. Only under incandescent or low-spectrum light does it reveal its transformation, shifting from green to red, sometimes with startling intensity. But in mining fields, sorting rooms, and early collections, such testing was rarely performed. There was no reason to suspect more. As a result, many rough Alexandrite specimens were categorized as dull material and discarded. Stones that did not display immediate beauty were considered low priority. Prospectors focused on gems that announced themselves clearly. Collectors trusted what they could see. Alexandrite, quiet by nature, failed that test repeatedly. What was not yet understood was that Alexandrite's value was conditional. Unlike gemstones whose worth is constant across environments, Alexandrite depends entirely on context. Its crystal structure interacts with light in a highly specific way, responding differently to wavelengths most people never tested. Without the right conditions, the stone offers nothing. With them, it becomes unmistakable. Scientific understanding arrived too late to save many early specimens. Once the color change phenomenon was properly documented and understood, Alexandrite's reputation shifted dramatically. Stones once dismissed as uninteresting were re-evaluated when they could still be found, but many could not. They had been discarded during an era when no one thought to ask what a stone might look like under different light. The loss was subtle, but significant. Alexandrite was thrown away, not because it lacked value, but because it demanded patience. It refused to perform on cue. It required curiosity rather than confirmation, in a system built on quick judgment that made it invisible. Today, Alexandrite is recognized as one of the most remarkable gemstones ever discovered. Its value lies not only in rarity, but in behavior, how it responds to change rather than how it appears at rest. Its story offers a clear lesson. Some stones do not reveal themselves when asked directly. They wait for the right conditions. And when those conditions are never provided, even extraordinary value can pass through human hands unnoticed, quiet, dull, and forgotten in the daylight. In first place, Painite. The stone people discarded because there was no reason to stop. In its rough form, Painite offers nothing to signal importance. It does not sparkle. It does not display a striking color. It does not resemble any gemstone most people recognize. Often appearing as a small, brownish crystal with muted surfaces, it blends seamlessly into collections of ordinary mineral fragments. When encountered without context, it looks like a stone that can safely be ignored. And for decades it was. Painite's story is not one of rejection through judgment, but rejection through indifference. There was no dramatic dismissal, no conscious decision that it lacked value. Instead, it failed to trigger curiosity at all. It looked too ordinary to question, too unremarkable to examine, too familiar to justify keeping. That absence of reaction sealed its fate. In gemology, attention is often driven by contrast. Stones that stand out are examined. Stones that do not are filtered away. Painite did not stand out. It did not resemble ruby, sapphire, or any known gemstone. It did not exhibit unusual optical effects. Without a reference point, there was no reason to pause long enough to ask what it might be. Discarding it required no explanation. What was not known at the time was that painite was not merely rare. It was almost singular. Its chemical composition and crystal structure placed it outside existing classifications. It formed under highly specific conditions that occurred only in an extremely limited geological environment. But without tools capable of detecting those distinctions, painite remained invisible among countless other brown minerals. Recognition came not through discovery, but through accident. When painite was finally identified and studied, the realization was immediate and unsettling. What had once been overlooked as trivial was revealed to be one of the rarest mineral species ever documented. For a time, only a handful of verified specimens existed in the entire world. Many others, it became clear, had likely been lost long before anyone knew what to look for. By then, recovery was impossible. Painite had not been thrown away because it failed to meet expectations. It had been thrown away because it never created expectations at all. It arrived without spectacle, without familiarity, and without a story to anchor it. In a system built on recognition, that absence was fatal. Even experts were not immune. Without established diagnostic criteria, early painite specimens passed through hands unnoticed. They were cataloged incorrectly, stored without priority, or removed entirely. The stone did not announce its rarity. It required deliberate analysis to be understood, and analysis rarely begins without suspicion. Today, painite is known as one of the rarest gemstones on Earth. Its value lies not only in scarcity, but in what its history reveals about human perception. It demonstrates how easily significance can be lost when it does not align with expectation. How rarity can exist quietly, without defense, until it is too late. Painite's story is the purest expression of this list's theme. It was not discarded because people were wrong. It was discarded because there was no reason, at the time, to think it mattered. And that may be the most irreversible mistake of all. None of these stones were lost by accident. They were let go, because at the time, there was no reason to keep them. They didn't change. Understanding did. These gemstones remind us that value doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it stays quiet, until it's too late. If you've ever been told something you owned wasn't worth keeping, this story may feel familiar, and that question is worth sitting with. Thank you for watching.